And our next company that we're going to present is Saniona and CEO Rami Levin. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you to present the company. Go ahead.
Thank you, Victor. So I'd like to share with you a bit of the highlights of Saniona and some of the recent updates and advances that we've managed to accomplish over the last few months and even years. So Victor, if we can move to slide number 2. Just at a high level, who Saniona is, we are a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company. We are focused on rare diseases specifically, and specifically in the central nervous system. Our most advanced treatment in clinical development is a product called Glycemic, which we are developing in 2 rare eating disorders. The first one is Prader-Willi syndrome, and the second one is hypothalamic obesity. Prader-Willi syndrome, we've completed a phase 2A study. We've been in conversations and discussions with the FDA on our continued development and plans. And we plan to kick off our next clinical program in Prader-Willi, which is phase 2B, with the intent for that to be a pivotal registration trial. We plan to kick that off before the end of the year. The second indication is hypothalamic obesity. We just released our phase 2 positive results about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I will share with you a bit later today. Same here. Our goal will be to interact and collaborate with the FDA and align on the next steps in clinical development. Our goal is to kick off a phase 3 registration trial starting in Q1 next year. If we think of companies that have mid-late stage clinical development programs, we can probably find quite a few. But what is unique about Saniona is the combination, excuse me, of a late stage clinical development program coupled with a unique drug discovery platform. And that unique drug discovery platform will fuel our future portfolio of products moving forward. 2 of the most advanced molecules in preclinical development are, one is SAN711, which we are exploring in rare neuropathic itching disorders. SAN711 is ready to go into phase 1 clinical trials. And the second one is SAN903, which is slightly earlier in the preclinical development, which we are exploring in rare inflammatory disorders. And as I said, both of those molecules, the goal would be to advance them through the clinical development at the heels of Glycemic. One of the advantages of being a rare disease company is the ability in research to prioritize those molecules that we identify that we intend to develop ourselves in rare diseases. And being a rare disease company, those molecules that we will identify, like SAN711 and 903, for rare disorders, we have the full intent to develop them ourselves and ultimately commercialize them ourselves as well. We will, however, also discover as part of that research molecules that are probably more intended for large indications. And being a rare disease company, we do not intend to develop those molecules in those large indications. In those cases, we will partner with larger pharmaceutical companies for them to develop and ultimately commercialize. And under those agreements, we intend to get milestone payments throughout the development and ultimately royalties once those products are launched. And we actually already have 3 examples of that actually happening. We have an out-licensing agreement for one of our products called tesofensine with a company called Medix. Medix have obesity clinics in Mexico and Argentina. And we out-licensed tesofensine to Medix for them to develop it in obesity, which is obviously a large indication. In Mexico alone, the obesity market is about a $200 million market, of which Medix have about half, 50% market share. They've completed a phase 3 last year, and based on those results, they've actually submitted the file for approval to the Mexican health authorities, and they expect an approval in the second half of this year. Once on the market, Saniona will be getting royalties on sales. So we anticipate that to, kick off before the end of the year. We also have other out-licensing agreements a bit earlier stage, like a product called CAD 1883, which we partnered with Cadent Therapeutics, which are based in the Boston area. They're developing it for two indications, essential tremor and ataxia, which are both large indications. And we also have an ongoing relationship with Boehringer Ingelheim, where we out-license two molecules for their schizophrenia research. And under that agreement, we will be getting milestone payments throughout the development, as well as royalties once the products or either of the products are launched. Our goal as a company is we're expanding beyond Denmark, which is where we are currently based. We are a Danish company listed on the Swedish Stock Exchange, but our focus is to the U.S. as well. This is the largest rare disease market in the world. This is where many of the healthcare investors are based. This is where all our clinical trials will take place moving forward, and it is critical for the company to be based close to where all that is happening. That is the reason I was hired back in January. That is the reason that a few weeks ago we hired a chief medical officer here with me in the Boston area. And as we move forward with the company, the goal is to build out the company here in the U.S. so that really what we will have remaining in Copenhagen is really our research facility, our labs, our people led by our chief scientific officer, but the rest of the organization as we build it out will all be based here in the U.S. So let's talk about our leading product, which is Tesamet. Tesamet is a true triple monoamine reuptake inhibitor, which controls the eating. And the way it does it is by when you introduce Tesamet, you increase the levels of three monoamines, which are dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, which are critical for the reward center and the appetite center in the brain. And by impacting that, we basically get the impact that we want to see in both Prader-Willi and hypothalamic obesity, which is the reduced craving for food, the reduced appetite, and the increased metabolic fat burn. Those are key factors in both of those rare disease indications, and Tesamet works exactly on those two centers that influence that. So clearly we thought Tesamet would be a good, based on its mechanism of action, a good treatment for those two indications, and we can go into a bit more of the data. So I'll jump straight into slide 5 to give a bit of background about the first indication, which is hypothalamic obesity. Hypothalamic obesity is an acquired rare disease as a result of an injury to the hypothalamus, typically as a result of a rare brain tumor called craniopharyngioma. And as a result of that removal of that brain tumor, it causes an injury to the brain, to the hypothalamus specifically, and that results in this constant craving and desire to eat, which results in a very short period of time, results in obesity. There are about between 3,400 and 6,800 patients in the U.S. with hypothalamic obesity. There are about 5,500 to 11,000 patients in Europe with hypothalamic obesity. This is an ultra rare. There is no treatment available for hypothalamic obesity, and therefore there is very sparse data also in terms of prevalence, which is why you see the ranges are so large. Some of the characteristics of hypothalamic obesity are memory impairment, attention deficit and impulse control, and ultimately depression and sometimes suicide as well. And we conducted a phase 2 study. If we move on to slide 6, we conducted a phase 2 study, which was a 24-week study of placebo, double-blind placebo-controlled study, placebo versus one arm of Tesamet, and those are the results that we released just a few weeks ago. The study was with 21 patients. The primary endpoint was safety, which is typical for a phase 2 study. And there was a whole variety of secondary efficacy endpoints. After 24 weeks, the patients were all offered the opportunity to move to active treatment, to Tesamet. So those who were on Tesamet already were allowed to continue for an extra 24 weeks, and those that were on the placebo group were allowed to switch to the active group of Tesamet. I will share the results in a second. Out of the 21 patients that started the trial, 18 patients finished it, so only had 3 dropouts, 2 from the placebo group, 1 from the treatment group, and all the 18 continued to the placebo, to the open label phase of the trial, and that is still ongoing at the moment. Our goal is to, as I mentioned, to meet with the FDA on the placebo control phase of the trial, which is the important phase of the trial to move forward, and we intend to do that later this year. So if we move on to slide 7, just to talk about some of the results. Some of the key efficacy parameters. First of all, I should say that the Tesamet was safe and well tolerated. And I think just the fact that 18 patients completed the trial out of the 21 that started is testament to the fact that it was safe and well tolerated. When we look at the efficacy parameters, then there were 3 main parameters that we looked at. One, which is probably the most important one, was the change in weight from baseline. You can see the difference of minus 6.1%. This was highly statistically significant and clinically meaningful. If you go to the next slide, we also looked at waist circumference. Here as well, you can see nearly 5% reduction from the Tesamet group versus a placebo. Again, highly significant and clinically meaningful. And the last one was HbA1c, glycemic control, again, change from baseline to week 24. And here again, nearly 15%. A reduction on the treatment group versus a placebo, and here again, statistically significant. There's a large database which we are still exploring, and ultimately, at the end of the day, all this data will be published. This, considering the fact that there is no treatment available, is extremely encouraging data, and definitely supporting the continued development of Tesamet moving into what we plan to be a phase 3 registration trial. So if we look at the conclusion, again, this is pretty much what I said on slide 10. But we also explored Tesamet in another indication. If we move on to slide 12, the second indication is Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader-Willi is a different rare disease, although there are some similarities. Unlike hypothalamic obesity that we just discussed, Prader-Willi is a genetic disease, so you're actually born with Prader-Willi. It's a slightly larger rare disease indication. The birth incidence is 1 in 10,000 to 30,000. There are about 200,000 people worldwide affected by Prader-Willi syndrome. And you can see the numbers both in the US and in Europe. So a slightly larger indication than hypothalamic obesity. And it is a genetic disease. And the difference here is that unlike hypothalamic obesity, where the characteristics are similar to the general obese population, Prader-Willi, even though these are obese patients, their body composition is very different. They have very low body mass. They have very low bone density. Really, mostly what they have is fat. Hyperphagia in this case, which is this constant desire to eat nonstop, is the main characteristic of this disease, and is the primary, typically the primary endpoint of what we look at. These patients have short life expectancy, usually between 30 to 40 years. They have some intellectual disabilities, physical deficiencies, and behavioral problems, and really a significant burden on the families. Primarily, this constant desire to eat is probably the most impactful on families. And here we conducted, if we move to slide 13, we conducted a phase 2A. The first part of the study was a 3 months double-blind placebo control study in adults. Once that study was completed, we conducted a separate study in adolescents. The first part of that study was a double-blind placebo control at a lower dose. We then transitioned all the patients, or offered the patients to transition to treatment. So those that were on Tesamet continued on Tesamet, and those that were on placebo were offered to go to Tesamet at the same dose. And then we had another open label extension where we actually doubled the dose for another 3 months. That was the study design. And if you go to slide 14 to see the results, so on the left, you see the results on the hyperphagia, which, as I mentioned, is the main primary endpoint in Prader-Willi syndrome. And you can see the substantial difference between the placebo group and the treatment group, where the treatment group, the hyperphagia basically went down to pretty much zero at the end of the trial, the 3 months, whereas the placebo group, after a placebo effect initially, started to increase, and you can see the difference, which ended up to be statistically significant. This was a relatively high dose of 0.5 for adults. When we went into the adolescents, we decided to cut the dose by 4, and we reduced it from 0.5 to 0.125. And on the right, you can see the study in adolescents. The first part on the left side of that graph on the right is the placebo control phase of the adolescents group. And what you can see actually is that this was too low of a dose, and there actually was not a statistical difference between the placebo group and the active group. After 3 months, all the placebo patients were offered to go on Tesamet for an extra 3 months. There again, there wasn't a big difference because the dose was too low. But on the furthest to the right part of the right graph, that is when we actually doubled the dose to 0.25 milligrams. And there you could actually start seeing quite a substantial decrease in hyperphagia, suggesting that the appropriate dose for these patients is probably 0.25. That is further, if we move to the next slide, slide 15, that is further strengthened when we look at weight loss and body weight reduction. And here on the graph on the left, you similarly can see the adults is the furthest to the left, and you can see a substantial decline in weight loss versus placebo of minus 5.6 in the adults. We then moved into the adolescents. In the middle bars there are the adolescents placebo control phase, and similar to hyperphagia where there was no difference. We didn't see a difference between this low dose of 0.125 on weight loss either. However, when we move to the higher dose of 0.25, that's when you can start seeing a reduction in weight also in the adolescents group. Again, suggesting that 0.25 is probably the right dose in Prader-Willi syndrome. And the graph on the right really shows the correlation, or the negative correlation between the weight loss and the in the plasma or the PK levels of Tesamet in the blood. And if you go to the next slide, based on those results, we decided to continue with our development, and we proposed quite a robust phase 2B trial. We've had conversations with the FDA as part of our collaboration with the FDA, and we have proposed quite a robust phase 2B trial, which we plan for that to be a pivotal trial with the intent that based on the results, the FDA could actually approve the drug. This will be a 16-week trial with 4 different arms, placebo, and 3 different doses, a 0.125, 0.25, and 0.375. We're planning to recruit about 144 patients to this study, and we want to kick off this study before the end of this year. Based on the results of the placebo control phase of the study, we will be discussing with the FDA, the possibility for approving. And if the FDA feels that we need additional data, then we're already baking into the plans a potential phase 3 to follow. And last but not least, just as conclusion, we are rapidly advancing towards late-stage clinical development. As I showed, we're looking at 2 clinical trials, one a phase 3 registration trial, one a phase 2b pivotal trial, both in hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. We are planning to build a strong U.S. presence. We have started the recruitment. I was the first trigger. We've hired a CMO. We're recruiting a CFO. And the goal is to build a full-fledged organization here in the U.S. But in the meantime, and on the way to that, I definitely see 2 potential revenue streams coming into Saniona. One would be our proprietary revenue based on our commercialization of our products, but a second revenue stream will come from these strategic partnerships and that licensing agreements. The most advanced, as I mentioned earlier, is the partnership that we have with Medix that is basically waiting for approval for tesofensine in obesity in Mexico later this year, which will start generating revenue for the company already in the second half of this year. And with that, I turn it back to Victor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rami, for a great presentation of Saniona. So my first question is if you have heard anything about Mexico and if the marketing authorization process is progressing according to plan there, or if we should expect delays due to the COVID-19 situation in the country.
Yeah. So I think it's likely that there may be some. I mean, I don't think it will delay beyond second half of this year. But of course, the first part of the year, they were quite focused on COVID-19, as many of us were. So there may be some delays, but it still will, or it's still anticipated to be in the second half of this year.
Okay, great. And also a question on hypothalamic obesity. So there are some, quite many children who have this disease. In your phase 2, did you include any children in that study, or is that something you also plan to do in the later studies in order to include that patient population?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So our phase 2 study was only in adults, and interestingly, they're quite 2 distinct patient populations. There's the children, and then separately there are the adults. We've conducted the phase 2 in adults, but our goal ultimately will be to ensure that every patient who needs Tesomet, whether adults or pediatric, will have access to it. What that means is that we will need, as we start building our phase 3 clinical program and working with the FDA, we'll need to work with them and figure out what will it require to be able to approve it in both patient populations. Possibly it would be 2 separate clinical trials. I think our plan will probably be to start with adults, which is the larger patient population, and then expand and do another trial in pediatrics. Again, ultimately, the goal will be to ensure that every patient who needs it will have access to it.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your presentation that you released your top-line results from your hypothalamic obesity study, but will we see the full result from the study at an upcoming medical conference here soon, or do you have any updates regarding that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're definitely planning to not only present it in clinical conferences. Of course, with COVID, many of these conferences are either being canceled or trying to figure out a different solution of how to present it. But also on top of that, the goal will definitely be to publish the full results in a peer-reviewed medical journal.
Great. So I think we're out of time here, but it was a very good presentation, and I wish you good luck going forward here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.